The airplane was filled with the usual hustle and bustle of passengers preparing for takeoff. The flight from New York to London was going to be a long one, but for now, everything seemed routine. The overhead bins were being closed, seat belts fastened, and the final announcements were being made. The plane's cabin glowed with a soft, warm light, and the low hum of engines started to echo through the walls of the aircraft. Amid the activity, Ava Johnson, a Black Flight Attendant, walked down the aisle with grace. Her movements were smooth and confident, her uniform impeccable. She greeted passengers with a calm and professional demeanor, helping an elderly woman adjust her seatbelt and reassuring a nervous couple in the middle row. Ava's reputation as one of the most reliable flight attendants in the airline was well earned. She was known for her dedication and kindness, her ability to handle difficult situations with a smile, and her calm presence no matter what chaos unfolded around her. But tonight, something was different. The moment Ava passed by, Richard, a middle-aged businessman sitting in the aisle seat of the first-class section, stood up abruptly. His eyes narrowed as he watched her approach, his expression shifting from boredom to something darker. "Are you really the one in charge here?" His voice cracked like thunder in the otherwise peaceful cabin, cutting through the noise of rolling luggage and murmured conversations. Heads turned. The passengers around him fell silent, unsure of what to make of his outburst. Ava stopped mid-step, her back straightening as she turned toward him. Richard leaned back in his seat, sneering as if he owned the entire airplane. His suit was pressed to perfection, and his expensive watch gleamed under the lights. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "What are you even doing here? You don't belong on this plane." The words felt like a slap in the face to everyone who overheard them. It wasn't just the rudeness, it was the disdain, the deep-seated belief that someone like Ava shouldn't be in charge of anything. Certainly not an airline, certainly not a luxury flight. Ava's breath caught in her throat, but her face remained a mask of professionalism. She couldn't let him see the sting of his words. She had been in this situation before. Racism, discrimination, she'd faced it more times than she cared to count. But it didn't make it any easier to hear. Ava looked around. The other passengers were staring, some in disbelief, others with uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak up. Richard's words hung in the air, thick with tension. "Excuse me, sir, I would appreciate it if you would lower your voice," Ava said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Richard laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made the passengers flinch. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little criticism?" Ava's gaze didn't waver. "I'm just doing my job, sir. If there's an issue, I'll be happy to help." But before she could turn away, Richard shot back, "People like you shouldn't even be in this position. You should be back in the kitchen or somewhere you belong." Ava's heart skipped, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to lose control. She turned her attention back to him with a smile that barely hid the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Sir, if you continue with this behavior, I'll have no choice but to escalate it." Richard sneered. He wasn't done yet. But before he could utter another word, the scene cut to the cockpit. The camera zoomed in on the pilot, a seasoned man in his mid-40s, watching the situation unfold on the monitors. His expression hardened. He could hear the commotion through the intercom, his hand resting on the switch for the loudspeakers. He had been monitoring everything carefully. This wasn't just a routine flight. It was going to be a flight that changed everything. This was a moment that would alter the course of the passengers' lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The tension in the air was palpable. Ava stood frozen, her back straight, waiting for the next words from Richard. The other passengers watched, some shifting nervously in their seats, unsure of how things would unfold. What would happen next? Would this confrontation continue to escalate? Or was something about to change? The cabin of the luxury flight from New York to London was the epitome of comfort. The plush leather seats, The soft golden lighting and the gentle hum of the engines made it clear that this wasn't just any flight. The first-class passengers were used to the best, and they were about to experience it again. The sound of seatbelt clicks echoed through the cabin as the final preparations were being made. Ava Johnson moved effortlessly through the aisles, her navy blue uniform perfectly pressed, her name tag shining under the lights. Her presence was commanding yet gentle. She was the heart of the crew. Ava had always known how to balance professionalism with warmth. Her smile greeted each passenger as she passed, and her voice was soft but firm when giving instructions. She was everything a flight attendant should be, efficient, composed, and gracious. As she approached the first-class cabin, she caught the eye of a young mother who was trying to comfort her crying baby. Ava didn't hesitate for a moment. She knelt down beside the mother and offered a kind smile. "Would you like me to warm up the bottle for you?" Ava asked, her voice soothing. The young mother nodded gratefully, and Ava walked to the galley to make the baby formula, her movements as fluid as ever. For Ava, this was all in a day's work. But what most passengers didn't know was that Ava wasn't just a flight attendant. She was a force to be reckoned with. Beyond the polished exterior, Ava had a past filled with challenges, triumphs, and experiences that few would ever guess. She wasn't just here to serve drinks and snacks. She had a quiet power that radiated from her, something that made her different from the others. And today, that power would be tested. Ava returned to the first-class section with the bottle, handing it to the mother with a smile. The baby calmed down almost instantly, and the mother whispered her thanks. Ava turned to move back down the aisle when she felt a cold, hard stare from the far corner of the cabin. It was Richard, the man who had caught her eye earlier. Richard was the type of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. He had the look of someone who had always been given what he wanted: expensive suit, crisp tie, perfectly polished shoes, and a face that seemed incapable of showing warmth. His posture was that of a man who believed the world was made for him to rule, and everyone else was merely a player in his game. When his eyes met Ava's, there was a flicker of something unpleasant, a sense of entitlement, as if she was simply another obstacle to be ignored or controlled. Ava didn't flinch. She had seen his type before. She had learned to recognize the air of superiority in people like him, the way they looked down on others, the way they expected to be treated as more important simply because they had money or status. But Ava wasn't easily intimidated. She had seen it all. The job of a flight attendant required a lot of things, but above all, it demanded patience and the ability to maintain composure no matter what came her way. As she passed Richard's seat, she gave him a polite smile and nodded. "Is there anything I can assist you with, sir?" she asked in her usual calm, professional tone. Richard's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes scanning her face, sizing her up. "You can start by telling me why someone like you is in charge of this flight," he said, his voice low but sharp enough for nearby passengers to hear. The tone wasn't just curious, it was disdainful, as if he already believed that someone like Ava shouldn't have a role of authority. Ava's smile didn't falter. She simply tilted her head slightly and responded, "I'm here to ensure your safety and comfort, sir." Her voice was steady, polite, but the undercurrent of authority was clear. Ava knew how to handle people like Richard. She had done it countless times before. Her training in customer service and conflict resolution had taught her not to rise to the bait. Instead, she relied on her inner calm, something she had worked hard to cultivate over the years. What Richard didn't know was that Ava wasn't just a flight attendant. Before joining the airline, she had spent years in the Air Force, where she was trained as a pilot. She had flown combat missions, earned medals for her bravery, and gained skills that made her far more qualified than most of the passengers who sat in first class. She had taken to the skies long before becoming a flight attendant, but she had chosen this path because it allowed her to balance her love for aviation with a desire for a more peaceful life. Ava had seen more in her years than most people could imagine, and that made her stronger than Richard could ever comprehend. As she continued to move down the aisle, Richard's eyes followed her every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. There was something about her that didn't quite add up. How could someone like her, someone who seemed so composed, so in control, be working as a flight attendant? The question lingered in his mind, but he dismissed it quickly. It was easier for him to believe she was just another employee in a job that didn't require much thought. But little did Richard know, today he would learn that the world was not always what he thought it was. Richard leaned back in his seat, a satisfied smirk plastered on his face as he watched Ava continue with her duties. It was as if the entire world existed to cater to his needs. When Ava passed by again, he decided it was time to press the issue, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're just here to serve us, right?" Richard's words sliced through the calm atmosphere of the cabin, his tone dripping with arrogance. He didn't care that his voice was loud enough for others to hear. To him, she was just another employee, someone meant to make his experience more comfortable. Ava didn't flinch. She knew this was part of the job. Dealing with difficult passengers was something she'd trained for. But deep inside, it stung. No matter how many times she dealt with these situations, it never got easier. It never got less hurtful. Yet she stood tall, her face a mask of professionalism. "Sir, I would appreciate it if you would treat me with respect," Ava replied, her voice firm but polite. She knew better than to engage in his game, but her words were meant to set boundaries, to remind him that he couldn't bully her without consequences. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Respect? Ha! You're lucky I'm even talking to you. People like you don't deserve respect." His voice was louder now, and the passengers in the surrounding seats began to notice, casting quick, nervous glances in their direction. But none of them spoke up. None of them intervened. Ava's gaze never wavered. She had heard it all before, but the sting of his words, the undeniable cruelty, hit her like a physical blow. She didn't let it show, though. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Not here. Not today. As Ava continued down the aisle, Richard's mocking tone followed her like a shadow. "What are you going to do, huh? Call the captain? Tell on me?" His laughter rang out, hollow and cold, and the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could feel the tension building. They could hear Richard's words, but none of them wanted to get involved. It wasn't their fight. The whispers began. Some passengers exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, and Ava could feel the weight of their eyes on her. The silence of complicity was deafening. They didn't want to be seen as the troublemakers, the ones who would stand up and risk making things worse. They wanted peace, peace at any cost, even if it meant ignoring what was happening right in front of them. Richard's mockery grew bolder with each passing moment. "It's not even about your job, is it? You're just a maid in the sky, a servant." His voice was a cruel whisper now, aimed only at Ava, but loud enough for the nearby passengers to overhear. He was toying with her, testing her limits. Seeing how far he could push before she cracked, Ava's hands tightened around the tray she was holding, the only sign of the pressure she was under. Her knuckles turned white, but her face remained the same, calm, composed, in control. She walked past him again, her gaze steady, her every step calculated. She knew Richard was looking for a reaction, waiting for her to break. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Sir, I've asked you to keep your voice down. Please respect the rules of the flight." She kept her voice even, but the weight of her words was unmistakable. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let him win. But Richard was relentless. He wasn't interested in the rules. He didn't see her as an authority figure, just someone to be humiliated. "Rules? What rules? You're just here to make sure we don't spill our drinks, right? Just stay out of the way and keep serving, like the little worker you are." At this point, a quiet murmur began to spread through the cabin. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. They exchanged glances, their faces betraying their discomfort, but their lips stayed sealed. The tension was thick in the air, suffocating. Ava's pain was visible in her eyes, but it was hidden beneath her calm exterior. Richard, sensing the power he held in the situation, leaned back in his seat with a smug look. He was enjoying this, savoring the discomfort he caused. "What's wrong? Don't like being told your place?" He chuckled, low and threatening. Ava stood still for a moment, her eyes closing briefly as if to regain her composure. Then she turned toward him, her voice quieter but sharp as ever. "Sir, I've asked you politely to stop. I'm going to have to involve security if you continue this behavior." The words were a warning, but Richard wasn't deterred. "Go ahead. I'd love to see them throw me off this flight. But you?" Richard's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "You'll always be a servant." The other passengers watched the scene unfold, some uncomfortable, others looking away. The whispers grew louder now, like the buzz of an impending storm, but no one stood up to intervene. The silence in the cabin spoke volumes. They were all witnesses, yet no one spoke out. Ava could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their stares making her feel more isolated than ever. But she refused to give in. She would not let Richard win, not here, not now. She walked toward the cockpit, her steps steady, her back straight, and despite everything, she felt a quiet strength growing inside her. She would stand her ground. They were all witnesses, yet no one spoke out. Ava could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their stares making her feel more isolated than ever. But she refused to give in. She would not let Richard win, not here, not now. She walked toward the cockpit, her steps steady, her back straight, and despite everything, she felt a quiet strength growing inside her. She would stand her ground. Inside the cockpit, the hum of the engines filled the space, but there was a tense silence as Captain Miller observed the scene unfolding in the cabin. Through the small cameras monitoring the flight, he had seen enough. He had watched Richard's outbursts, his aggressive behavior toward Ava, and the growing discomfort among the passengers. The moment had come. Something had to be done. Captain Miller wasn't just a pilot. He was a man who had seen it all. He had flown through stormy skies, navigated through the worst of turbulence, and commanded some of the highest-profile flights in the world. But this situation was different. This wasn't just a passenger misbehaving, it was an attack on one of his crew members, a woman he deeply respected. He turned to his co-pilot, who nodded in silent understanding. Captain Miller took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment that would shift the dynamic on board. With a steady hand, he reached for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." His voice rang out across the cabin, calm yet authoritative, cutting through the murmurs of the passengers below. The room fell silent as they listened intently to what he had to say. "I'd like to take a moment to address a few things," he continued, his voice crisp and clear. "I've been monitoring the situation in the cabin, and it seems there's been some misunderstanding about one of our crew members." He paused for a beat, letting his words hang in the air. "That crew member, Ava Johnson, is not just any flight attendant." Ava's heart raced as she heard her name echoed across the cabin. She had always maintained her professionalism, but she couldn't help but feel a flicker of nervousness now. The atmosphere had already been charged, but the captain's words would turn everything on its head. "Ava Johnson is one of the co-owners of this airline," Captain Miller's voice rang out. His words hit like a thunderclap in the quiet cabin. "She's a decorated ex-Air Force pilot. She's flown combat missions, been awarded medals for her bravery, and holds multiple degrees in aviation and business management." Ava's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly masked her surprise, standing tall and still as the reality of the moment set in. She had never planned to reveal so much of herself to anyone, especially not in this way. But the captain's words were undeniable. They were a revelation, not just about her, but about everything Richard had misunderstood. The passengers looked at each other stunned as the weight of the announcement sank in. There was a moment of complete silence, and then Richard's face went ashen. His mouth fell open in disbelief. He had been so certain, so convinced of his superiority, that he had never once considered that the woman he'd been mocking and disrespecting might be someone of power, someone who could crush him with a single word. The color drained from his face as the reality of his situation hit him like a truck. The smirk that had previously graced his lips evaporated, replaced by a mixture of shock and humiliation. Ava? A co-owner? A decorated pilot? The woman he had tried to belittle wasn't just any flight attendant. She was someone much more powerful than he could have ever imagined. She was someone who, in a heartbeat, could have taken control of the entire flight if she wanted to. Ava stood there, feeling the eyes of every passenger on her. The whispers had stopped, replaced by stunned silence. Richard, his arrogance crumbling, now sat frozen in his seat. His mind raced, trying to process the truth. He had no idea who he had been messing with. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. His throat tightened as he realized that his words had just pushed him to the edge of disaster. His fingers gripped the armrest of his seat, knuckles white. He couldn't escape the crushing reality that he had humiliated the one person who could have easily destroyed him, and he had done it in front of an entire cabin of passengers. The other passengers, now aware of the gravity of the situation, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were embarrassed for Richard, others were simply stunned. It was clear that the dynamic had changed, and Richard's previous sense of superiority had disappeared. Captain Miller's voice came back over the intercom, smooth and steady. Ava has been a crucial part of this airline for many years. She's one of the reasons why we are able to offer the level of service we do. So, from here on out, I would kindly ask that you treat her with the respect she deserves. Ava, standing tall and composed in the aisle, could feel the change in the atmosphere. The tension in the cabin was still thick, but now there was a sense of quiet respect where there had been mockery just moments before. Richard, who had once tried to bully and belittle her, now sat in silence, his face still pale. He didn't know what to say or do. How could he even apologize? The damage had been done. The truth had been revealed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Ava locked eyes with Richard for a brief moment, her expression calm, unbothered by his previous attempts to degrade her. There was no smug satisfaction in her eyes, no need to gloat. She had nothing to prove. Instead, her gaze was simple, direct, and unwavering. She had just been vindicated, and Richard had just learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. As Captain Miller's announcement echoed in the cabin, the air had shifted, a palpable change settling over the flight. The passengers, who had previously remained silent or uncomfortable, began to stir. Their eyes now turned toward Richard, who sat frozen in his seat, pale and shaken. It was as if the room had collectively shifted its focus, and suddenly Richard was the one under scrutiny. No one was looking at Ava anymore, not in the same way. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances, the weight of their previous silence now heavy on their shoulders. Some of them even turned to Ava, their expressions a mixture of shame and regret. It was clear they had witnessed the truth of what had been happening, the bullying, the mockery, and now they realized just how wrong they had been to stay silent. One passenger, a middle-aged woman, leaned forward from her seat, her voice soft but apologetic. "I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. You deserve so much better." She said it loud enough for Ava to hear, and others nodded in agreement, their eyes avoiding Richard. Ava gave her a small, gracious smile, but there was no need for words. She hadn't expected anyone to apologize for their silence. It was enough that they were now showing her respect. She nodded back to the woman, silently accepting the apology. As the atmosphere in the cabin slowly began to change, it became clear that Richard's arrogance had started to crumble in front of everyone. The passengers, who had once kept their distance, now avoided eye contact with him. No one wanted to be associated with someone so rude, so full of himself. The whispers grew louder, and Richard could feel every eye on him. A flight attendant walked past Richard, her face stern, and subtly motioned to the crew at the back of the cabin. She was quiet, but her message was loud and clear. She had been informed about the situation, and Richard's fate was sealed. Moments later, another announcement came over the intercom, this time from the flight crew. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you that due to the serious nature of the incident involving Mr. Richard Carter, he has been permanently banned from flying with this airline." The words echoed through the cabin, and there was a sudden hushed silence. The reality of what had just been said settled like a heavy weight on everyone's shoulders. Richard, who had once thought he could get away with anything, was now being ostracized, not just by the passengers, but by the airline itself. Ava, standing at the back of the cabin, couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction justice had been served, but she refused to let herself become consumed by it. She was bigger than this moment. This wasn't about her victory, it was about the respect she deserved. Meanwhile, Richard, who had spent the entire flight deflecting every bit of responsibility for his behavior, now found himself in an impossible position. His previous arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound sense of regret that seemed to weigh him down. He had no words, no defense. He had only himself to blame for the situation he had created. He turned to Ava, his voice shaky, but he forced the words out, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. I shouldn't have." His apology trailed off, lacking sincerity. The words felt hollow, empty. Too little, too late. Ava didn't even look at him. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't need to acknowledge him. She had been through this kind of apology too many times before, but this one didn't even deserve her response. Without a single word, Ava turned and walked away, her head held high, her footsteps echoing through the cabin like a silent testament to her strength. She didn't need to stoop to his level. Richard sat there in silence, his face burning with embarrassment, his hands trembling slightly. He realized that his actions had not only destroyed his reputation, but had also isolated him from everyone around him. The passengers, who once may have looked to him as a wealthy businessman, were now completely disillusioned with him. The finality of the situation began to sink in as the passengers looked around, some exchanging glances with each other. They had witnessed a moment of truth, one that would stay with them long after the flight. The way they had judged Ava at first, the way they had ignored Richard's cruelty. Now they realized how wrong they had been. They had witnessed a change in the power dynamic, and it was clear who had come out on top. The flight continued, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. No one seemed eager to engage with Richard anymore. He had become a ghost, a pariah in the eyes of everyone aboard. But Ava remained the embodiment of grace and dignity, a woman who had earned respect not just because of her status, but because of her unshakable strength in the face of adversity. By the time the plane landed in London, Richard had learned a hard lesson. You cannot bully someone without consequences. And Ava had learned that true strength wasn't in fighting back with words, but in maintaining your dignity when others tried to tear you down. As the flight neared its descent into London, the turbulence that had rocked the plane earlier seemed to have calmed, leaving a stillness in the air. The passengers, still reeling from the events of the past few hours, sat in a quiet state of reflection. The tension that had once hung thick in the cabin had dissipated, but in its place was a profound sense of discomfort and perhaps guilt. Ava stood at the front of the cabin, her posture as poised as ever, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now. She wasn't just a flight attendant. She wasn't just the woman who had stood up to bullying and racism. Now she was a symbol, a woman who had taken control of the situation with dignity, and she knew that this was the moment to make her final stand. The passengers, some still unsure of how to react, looked up at her. There was no denying the respect they now felt for her. She had been the one to handle everything with grace, and now she would be the one to leave them with a final message. Ava waited for a moment, allowing the silence in the cabin to build, letting the weight of everything that had happened sink in. She then took a step forward, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience throughout this flight," Ava began, her eyes sweeping over the room. She made eye contact with a few of the passengers, including those who had earlier apologized to her. They nodded in quiet acknowledgement. "But there's something important I need to say, something that's been weighing on me throughout all of this." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Ava took a deep breath, the weight of her message crystal clear in her mind. This wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger. This was about the human condition, about how people treat each other, about how small acts of cruelty can create ripples that extend far beyond the moment. Today, many of you saw firsthand what happens when we allow bullying and disrespect to go unchecked. We all saw how one person's actions can cause harm to others, but we also saw what happens when we stand up, when we refuse to let hatred or ignorance take control. Ava's voice wavered slightly, but she kept her composure, her eyes shining with sincerity. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, they have no place in this world. Her words were firm, resolute. And no matter who you are or where you come from, we all deserve respect. Ava's gaze softened as she spoke directly to the passengers, her tone less forceful now, but equally impactful. We all have a choice. We can choose to remain silent when we see wrong, or we can speak up. We can choose to let someone feel small, or we can make them feel seen. She let the silence stretch for a moment, giving them time to truly take in her words. I am just one person, but I have learned that one voice can make a difference. One person standing up, one person refusing to back down, that is what creates change. It doesn't take millions of people. It takes courage. Ava's eyes swept across the passengers once more, her gaze steady. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be treated like less than anyone else because of the color of my skin. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. But I chose not to stay silent. She shifted slightly, her shoulders square, her hands held out to the side in a quiet gesture of unity. Respect isn't earned by what you own or the title you hold. It's earned by how you treat others, by how you show up for those who need it. And today, I hope you've learned that kindness, equality, and respect should never be optional. Ava took a moment to gather her thoughts, but it was clear she wasn't finished. When we stand together, when we choose to do the right thing, we create a world that's better for everyone. She let the words hang in the air, as if inviting the passengers to reflect on them. So, as you disembark today, I hope you remember this moment. Remember how easily cruelty can spread, but also remember how easily kindness can change everything. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that could be felt in the silence that followed. The passengers were no longer just sitting in their seats. They were thinking, reflecting, perhaps questioning their own choices, their own actions. Ava had left them with something far more powerful than any apology. She had left them with a message that would stick with them long after the flight was over. Ava's voice softened as she concluded, "Thank you for listening." With that, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her head high. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had said what needed to be said. The passengers, now silent, watched her leave, each person lost in their own thoughts. Richard, who had once sat so boldly among them, now sat in quiet shame. He had been the lesson in all of this, but now it was up to the passengers to take that lesson with them. As the plane finally touched down in London, no one moved immediately. The cabin was still, as if everyone needed a moment to process everything that had happened. Ava's words had left a lasting impact on each and every one of them. And as they stood up to leave, they didn't just step off the plane. They carried with them the quiet resolve that the world could be different, that if everyone chose kindness, equality, and respect, the world would be a much better place. As the plane touched down on the runway in London, the engines roared with the finality of the journey. But there was something else in the air, something more profound than the usual relief of arrival. The passengers slowly began to rise from their seats, stretching and gathering their belongings, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The quiet reverence that filled the cabin reflected the impact of everything that had happened. One by one, as they passed through the aisle, the passengers stopped by Ava, some of them hesitating at first, unsure of how to express their gratitude. But the sincerity in their eyes made it clear. They weren't just thankful for her professionalism. They were grateful for her strength, her courage, and the lesson she had taught them all. A middle-aged man, his face now softened with respect, reached out to her as he exited. "Thank you for showing us what it really means to be strong." Ava nodded, a gentle smile crossing her lips. She had heard these words from a few passengers already, but this time it felt different, real. It wasn't just an apology for Richard's behavior, it was an acknowledgement of her dignity in the face of adversity. A woman with 2 children followed, her eyes full of remorse. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier. I should have said something." Ava smiled at her, the warmth in her expression showing no bitterness. "It's okay. We all have a choice. Just make sure next time you'll speak out." As the passengers continued to exit, many of them whispered their thanks, offering nods of approval, some even pausing to shake her hand. The cabin was filled with muted conversations, but they weren't about travel destinations or the usual small talk. They were about the event that had just unfolded, a shift in perspective, a realization that standing up for what's right was the only way to truly make a difference. Ava stood there, watching as the last of the passengers made their way toward the exit. The final few passed her, offering words of admiration, leaving her feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. She hadn't just done her job, she had changed minds. As the last passenger stepped off the plane, Ava took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing. Her smile grew wider, but it wasn't out of pride. It was the kind of smile someone has when they know they've done something that matters, when they know that in the face of adversity, they didn't back down. She had stood up for what was right, and that was more important than anything else. The camera cut to her standing at the entrance of the plane, watching the last passenger exit. Ava's expression was calm, confident, but there was a quiet fire in her eyes, a resolve that would stay with her long after the flight was over. Suddenly, the screen faded to black, and bold text appeared, filling the screen with a message that was clear and direct. If you believe in equality, stand up for what's right. Subscribe for more stories that inspire change.